Welcome to Measurably Better Learning, the podcast built for learning and development professionals. Whether you're an instructional designer, L&D professional, or corporate leader, get ready for insights and ideas that will transform your approach to learning, training, and development. So let's dive in. Welcome to the Measurably Better Learning podcast. My guest today is Miriam Taylor, my colleague and my friend, and always happy to have a conversation with you. I learn an awful lot. Probably most of what I've learned from you about learning. I think
it's very, very mutual.
You've dragged me along kicking and screaming, and I appreciate that. So we're in a series of podcasts talking about the various roles of a learning leader and what a learning leader needs to both do and be.
Yeah.
And something about the kind of skills you need to have, but then also the kind of person you need to be, the kind of human being you need to be. Today, we're going to talk about the learning leader as an instructional design kind of guru, right? And you and I have talked about this, are you a guide? Are you a guru? Is the leader of the team the strongest instructional designer on the team? And so I want to just ask you that and have you kind of think out loud through that. Let's say you're a manager. Let's say you're a vice president. Or a chief learning officer. How much do you really need to know about how the sausage gets made?
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think historically, learning teams, which they probably weren't called that, they were training teams. The people that were on those teams had a pretty strong background in technical writing maybe or training. I still remember somebody telling me way back, when I say way back, it probably mean like the 60s or 70s, that when they had training, they would basically stop by your desk if you were a subject matter expert. They'd grab all these notebooks from you and they'd walk away and they'd say, in 6 months, we'll deliver training. It reminded me of the old Saturday Night Live skit, right? With the IT guy, like, move over.
Get out of the way.
Yeah.
Move.
Right.
Yep.
So historically, I would say they had some kind of background. But what is interesting, of course, is that as we see the Chief Learning Officer not just have a seat at the table, but an important part of the table, as we've talked about in the past. Those learning leaders don't always, in fact, they often come from a more general business or an HR or organizational development, which are all valuable. Yeah. And I think actually bring an important piece to the table for the learning team. But you have an interesting dynamic now because you have people that are classically trained and then perhaps their leader isn't. And there can be a lot of dissonance there if it's not handled correctly.
So what are the positives and negatives of that? Because you have to understand something at least of the process.
Sure.
Okay. So walk us, what are the positives and negatives of that?
Yeah, I think coming from originally very much of an education and instructional design background, I had a lot to learn about how business worked, how, as we talked about in a past podcast, like the strategic systems. So having someone that comes out of an organizational development background or even a business HR background can add a lot to the team because they do understand the larger system. They can connect what the team is doing for developing learning and training with the larger organizational goals, which have to happen. On the other hand, it can be a little frustrating if they're sort of on the front lines and they don't quite know how to articulate what you do, or they maybe promise things that can't be done. We've all had bosses, so sure, we can make that for you in a week or
right. They think this takes 45 minutes. Right. I'll be back in an hour.
Right. Exactly. Kind of a thing. So, so there's some positives, and then I think there's some negatives, which I think the negatives can be handled by a learning leader who perhaps they don't have that background. I think we're going to talk more about that, but there's ways to overcome that.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to return to the original question a little bit. Does a learning leader need to understand, or what does a learning leader need to understand about instructional design, and then to what level?
Yeah. So I think a learning leader absolutely has to understand instructional design.
Yeah, I agree.
But I don't think they have to be at the level of, for example, we all have people on our team who, they are amazing. You sit them down with, some materials and they are cranking out objectives and they love it. And, they're exactly right. And then they're creating measurements that tie back to those objectives. And they're just detail, people, and they're in the weeds and they understand the content. And a learning leader, frankly, doesn't have time for that.
Right.
But what they do need to understand, I think, are two key things. They need to understand learning strategies, meaning they do need to understand how adult learners learn.
For sure.
They do need to understand the general strategies that you can use, whether that's deliverables like a micro-learning or a podcast or e-learning, but just in general, other ways that we can teach effectively, create effective. And then I think they have to understand the process, because a lot of instructional design is driven by process, and you don't have quality if you can't stick to the process.
Yeah. One of the things I appreciate about you and the other instructional designers on our team is in a review cycle, I'll look at something and go, oh, well, that looks fine. And, you and others will go, that right there doesn't make sense. That doesn't tie back to the objectives. Where is this going? It just sort of falls off a cliff. To even the visuals, like this doesn't really support that. And I think there's a good design eye in there too that comes from that. So, all right, well, when we come back, we'll talk in a little bit more specificity about this. So we'll be right back.
Imagine a world where every training session, every learning module, and every translated document is aligned with your company's unique goals and global ambitions. Welcome to Ingenuity, where we don't just talk about elevating your corporate learning, we make it happen. At Ingenuity, we understand the heart of your business is its people. That's why we specialize in creating custom learning solutions and translation services that are not just effective, but are designed specifically for your business's global needs. Let us show you how learning cannot be just better, but measurably better, with solutions tailored just for you. Learn more in the description below.
Welcome back, everybody. And again, Miriam, thanks for sharing your thoughts today. So before we took a break, we were talking about how a learning leader could shore up their knowledge of instructional design if needed. Being in the trenches, right, doing this day to day really helps provide that experience. But what are some other ways? How else can people and I'm assuming there are listeners who are in positions where the people that report to them know way more about this. How did they come to a stronger understanding of what's happening?
Yeah, so I do want to hit on being in the trenches just for a second. Even if, for example, as a learning leader, you're not responsible for writing a storyboard, or there's lots of things that you can do. I just recently revised some internal training for people on our team. It wasn't anything formal, but just the process of going through, like, what do I want them to learn? How is this going to look? You and I both write a lot of articles, just that sort of thing. There's always something a learning leader can do to kind of mentally remember, like, oh yeah, we don't just crank that out. It takes some thinking. But beyond that, so we talked a lot about how process is really important. One of the big things a learning leader can do is, if there isn't a process, they need to help put that in place.
Even if they call it out. They're not creating it. They're simply making it obvious.
Right. And often, there's a good understanding of instructional design process. But the idea of being able to both support it and enforce it, and I don't mean that in a punitive way, but instructional designers or, your learning team, they're trying to make good quality materials on a timeline. And typically, we all know that the reason any of that breaks down is because our internal client or our external client isn't following the rules.
Right.
So one of the biggest thing a learning leader can do is help enforce that process externally. Articulate what it is, articulate what happens to the timeline when it's not followed, and really champion the group so that whatever external business unit they're working with understands this is how it happens and it has to work this way, or you're not going to get what you want.
And sometimes you have people on your team who don't want to work in that process, don't like to work in that
for sure.
process, right?
Yeah.
They are often highly creative, but also very frustrating to other people because they're saying, well, this is a cookbook recipe and we're following it because we have a lot of content to create. You're not you like through the cookbook door those you threw those pages out, and the rest of us are anticipating things that you're not ready. How about upskilling and reskilling?
Yeah. And I think, unfortunately, for learning teams, it doesn't happen often enough. Here we are in the weeds of developing learning and training, but we don't, they don't get that opportunity. But the evolution, I think, over time of the instructional designer, it used to be an instructional designer start to finish, right? Like you collect the source material, you meet with the SME, all the way to developing that e-learning or whatever it is in the software tool. But over time, I mean, everything has become so sophisticated that expecting those skills out of the same person. And so I think a big part of upskilling is honestly taking stock of your team with them. What are their competencies? Some people are amazing at writing stories and engaging material, creative writers, but you probably don't want them developing like this custom graphic, you know. Or on the other hand, like you said, you have those highly creative people that can design an amazing like user experience, but you don't want them editing or writing a storyboard because their grammar is just not amazing.
Or even laying out how all these pieces fit together.
Yes.
Right? Like the whole structure of the thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the key to upskilling is figuring out what competencies people on your team have, championing those, giving them an opportunity to grow in those, and then maybe you backfill, you plug the gaps of the things, the holes you're seeing, rather than asking an instructional designer to be able to do it all.
Yeah. That wasn't that long ago that was the case.
Oh, I still have.
Yeah.
You don't want to see the stuff.
You still have some really bad graphically
designed. Edited myself. Clip art. It's bad.
I would actually like some of those. I'd probably like to frame.
You have to get it off a floppy disk. Or
something. There we go. I'm sure I have a computer at home that can do that. Well, let's kind of move on to our last question here. How does a learning leader foster innovation? And part of that is what is innovation, but how do you create the new?
Yeah. So I might not answer this in the way that you think I'm going to. I mean, obviously we go to conferences, obviously those kinds of things, but, and I think a learning leader at the higher level does have a little more opportunity to maybe think and then send information on to the team. But if you're in the middle of a project and your learning leader is like blasting you with article, I'm just frustrated at this point.
Right.
But really, I think the way to foster innovation is to make sure that everyone on your team has an opportunity to try new things, to think about new things. For a while, when you and I worked together, we had like some white space time.
Yep, little sandbox, place to play.
Right, because you know what? The people on your team, by and large, they know what's coming. They know what could be done.
Right.
You give them some time to play around with that, you'll be amazed at how innovative they can be.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, a little bit different approach.
It is, and sometimes it's connecting things that seem unrelated. Innovation a lot of times comes from a little bit of that, some of that, a big piece of that, and individually you would never look at that and go, well, wow, that's the coolest thing. That no one's going to do that. But really creative team members will oftentimes pull pieces of things together, and the end result is, wow, did not see that coming.
Yeah, but they have to have the time.
Yeah,
it's just important.
Yeah, space. All right. Well, again, Miriam, thank you, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Sounds good.
Before we wrap up the show, if you're looking to dive deeper, we've got tons of free downloads, L&D resources, and details about upcoming webinars that you won't want to miss. They're found in the episode description. Plus, if you ever want to chat with either one of us, now's your chance. You can find links in the episode description to connect directly with Miriam or me. We're here to answer your questions and to discuss all things learning and development. And speaking of questions, we love hearing from you. Whether it's a question or a comment or a topic you're curious about, or if you just want to join the conversation, drop us a comment on your favorite social media channel. Your input shapes our shows. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform. It's the best way to ensure you never miss out on our latest episode. We're excited to continue to transform learning into a measurable success with you. Until next time.